Australia should be the richest country in the world, right? Because we have pretty much everything the world needs other than oil. So this chart on the left-hand side basically shows country reserves of all the materials that are used in batteries, right? So we've got, lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, copper, all sorts of stuff. Australia's at the top of that. We have the world's highest resources of everything that goes into a battery, right? So if we're going to go towards an electrified world whereby batteries are going to power everything, etc., which is the plan, well, Australians should be milking it in, right? We're also the biggest iron ore exporter. We're the biggest coal exporter in the world, and we're the second biggest gas exporter in the world. And as the chart in the middle at the top there shows, Australia has benefited the most from rising commodity prices. So what that chart shows is it shows the terms of trade across countries. What terms of trade is basically the price you receive for your exports versus the price you pay for your imports. It's a ratio. And we've had the biggest, effectively, national pay rise in the world, right? So you think with that, we should be swimming in budget money. But unfortunately, we just don't tax this stuff properly. And as the charts on the right show, this is just looking at oil and gas taxation. Australia's at the top, Norway's at the bottom on the right-hand side. Australia's had a massive gas boom whereby, billions of dollars in revenue on gas exports has been earned. But as the orange bars show, the federal government's collected hardly anything from it. Whereas Norway, which is at the bottom, taxes their oil and gas exports at about 80%. So Norway is a major oil and gas exporter like Australia, not as big as us, but because it's a tiny country, it's only 5.5 million people, about roughly the size of Melbourne. But because it's taxed it properly, it's swimming in money. And as the bottom middle chart shows, Norway has invested that money in a sovereign wealth fund, which is basically, it's like a future fund, but it only invests overseas. And it's basically rehypothecated all its tax revenue from its oil and gas exports, invested overseas. It's the biggest investor in companies like Microsoft, etc. And this fund is so big now, it's now worth over $300,000 US per Norwegian. So Norway are just sitting on this massive endowment of money. They're incredibly rich off their resources. And then you look at Australia and you say, well, what are we doing? Australia does the opposite. So instead of taxing our resources properly, Australia does dumb things like we grow our population aggressively. So Norway's population has grown by about 25% since 1960. Ours has grown by about 170% since 1960. So what we're doing is we don't tax it properly, and then we grow the population aggressively, which then dilutes your mineral base amongst more people.
Yeah.
And it just makes you ultimately poorer per capita. And so we do everything back to front here. And the fact of the matter is the federal government could solve the budget problem pretty easily if it just brought in a proper resources taxation regime. Because as these charts show, and there's, I could have put iron or coal and gas up here as well, but as the chart on the left shows, Australia is swimming in resources. So as I keep saying, I think we should get off this net zero bandwagon. China's increased their coal use by 50% in the last decade.
And we're providing most of that coal.
Yes. Yeah, well, actually, most of it comes from China. So China's the biggest producer, biggest importer, and biggest user. So they're actually the biggest producer of their own coal, and then they supplement it with our coal. But regardless, they've increased their coal use by about 50% last decade. India's increased theirs by about 70%. China burns about 30% more coal than the rest of the world combined. That's the chart on the left, the second one down. You can see the CO2 emissions in the top left chart there from our world in data. China just blows it off the chart, right? Australia's a little rounding error at the bottom. You can barely see it at the bottom of the axes. India's growing fast. China's growing fast. Those two are driving the world's rising carbon emissions. Certainly not Australia.
That's exactly the point I was making before. When Australia, with about 1% of the world's emissions, if we meet the target, if we reduce our emissions by 30%,
or to zero,
which I don't think anyone's actually thinking to achieve anything near that, we get Australia's contribution from 1% to 0.7%, while China and India, and it's not just a matter of China and India, it's the emerging world.
Yeah.
But if they're going to blow their emissions so completely out of the water, often using our coal or our gas, then what is the actual marginal utility of us meeting our target?
Yeah, that's right. So look, nearly 2/3 of the rise in carbon emissions since 2000 has been from China alone. And China has, in the top right hand, this comes from Statista. According to Statista, China and India have about 1,500 coal-fired generators versus Australia's 18. So the point here is, as this chart, the top middle chart here shows, Australia's committing energy suicide. So we export literally 7 times more gas. I think it's about 7 times more gas. The chart's pretty clear. The grey area there is what we export. The yellow is what we use. We export so much more coal. I think I should say gas. I meant coal. Coal than we use domestically, that it makes no sense to go and say, look, we're going to force ourselves off coal for intermittent and unreliable renewals, which cost a hell of a lot of money to build out, etc. When we're selling literally 7 times as much of that stuff to India and China and Japan.
And
Japan
to get that mild downturn in the yellow bar you've got there in that same chart you're talking about, we've basically killed our manufacturers.
Yes, which is
and at an underlying level, we've still got a domestic urban electricity system which is heavily dependent on coal and gas.
Yes, that's right. And so, the chart on the left is the Australia's manufacturing share. It's just been decimated, as I said, about 5% now. We export 7 times more coal than we use. We export about 4 times more gas nationally. So that's East Coast, West Coast, than we use. And on the East Coast, we export nearly, just over 70% of our gas. And we've actually increased the production of that gas. That's the chart on the top right there. We've increased our production of gas. We've doubled it in the last decade when the LNG export terminals in Gladstone open up. We've actually supplied the domestic market with 25% less gas. So what are we doing here? And all that's done is it's driven up East Coast gas prices, basically tripled them. And what that's done is that's driven up electricity prices, because gas is one of the key inputs into the wholesale electricity market. So you got to ask yourself, what are we doing here? Like, wouldn't it make more sense?
We're driving people into the non-market economy, so they're all becoming either actual or quasi-public servants. But at the same time, we aren't doing anything to make ourselves productive, and we're not driving people into high-paying government-funded jobs. We're driving them into generally low-paying, low-skilled government jobs. And at that point, can I just bring us back to the consumer?